Добрий день.
Good morning. I want to thank everybody who joins us. My name is Ola Atamanova, and it's my pleasure to see everyone who joins us at Ukraine Media Center. Today we have invited you for a presentation of guidelines for regional media and local authorities called Current Misinformation Challenges in the Regions of Ukraine and Relevant Countermeasures. So today we will be talking about such guidelines created for improvement of handling misinformation in the regions. So let me introduce our speakers. Joining us today are Alina, Tropynina, senior analyst at VoxCheck. Also joining us online is Nataliia Kalinichenko, head of the Association of Regional Media of Sumy Region NGO. And also joining us online is Moldavchuk, Director for Strategic Communications, Nationalities and Religions of Department of Zakarpattia, Regional Military Administration. Thank you for joining us. So, Ms. Alina, let's start directly with the guidelines. So, what stimulated you to create them? Who got involved in development of the recommendations? And then let's go straight forward to the recommendations themselves. Thank you very much for having me. I represent Vox Ukraine NGO, the fact-checking project, and one of our missions is popularization of critical thinking and training of people in media literacy. And we're interested in having the regional journalists, local authorities, as opinion leaders, as local opinion leaders, to be able to see, identify, and debunk the information threat. And specifically for this, we've developed those guidelines. So talking about us, we debunk at least 100 fakes on a monthly basis, and this is what we have sufficient resources for. On top of that, as the majority of fact-checking organizations, we focus on the whole of Ukraine, and we cannot cover every single piece of misinformation aimed to the regions. We can say that, unfortunately, the major part of Russian misinformation is aimed specifically at specific regions or even villages or towns. And unfortunately, they have technical capabilities to expand their fakes, disseminate their manipulations and propaganda. And here, the role of local authorities is to have better access to local information environment. They have an opportunity to debunk those threats because they have access to both social networks, messengers, chats, and local chats such as school groups and other social local groups. They are represented online. They have their websites, official web pages in the social media, and can timely communicate the debunkment of myth to the audience. And now the role of local authorities as the bridge between the government and the population is growing. Even as people are moving, as they live abroad, they continue keeping track of the local news, and they use regional media, regional mass media, and they continue following the local channels. And in coordination with NSDC, we've developed these guidelines for regional media and local authorities to make them a practical tool with development of algorithm of actions, how to act in this or those situations, to have the expanded tool set to react, to respond to Russian propaganda. Ms. Alina, it's really interesting. Let's stop at those tools that you've touched upon. So what are the specific cases when your recommendations can come in handy? Well, sure. Let me start with the fact that we decided to develop our guidelines with a glossary because it's really important as we talk about misinformation to understand the terminology, because there's a lot of terms related to misinformation, and it's critically important to know how to use them. For example, PSYOPs. We can see this term being used to describe regular fakes or manipulations. However, really, PSYOPs is a military operation that lasts for some specific period. It has a target audience, and target audience of PSYOPs is usually the military. So not every fake and manipulation is PSYOPs, and it's important to use the terms in relevant way. Another section we've decided to dedicate it to social media. Basically, how to identify non-authentic content in every single social network. And let me give you an example of Telegram. So, in Telegram, it's difficult to identify the signs of misinformation. However, there are details that can demonstrate that the account or content that you're viewing are unauthentic. You can see in the comments, usually the comments, or frequently the comments, are open in Telegram, and you can see the presence of the bots there. Also, there is a correlation between the common activity and the number of subscribers. For example, if we see if the channel has less than 20% of views out of the total number of subscribers, we can safely state that it's saturated with bots. And we have to pay attention to the links, because it may frequently happen so when the fake links are used to mimic the original ones. And here I would like to expand a little bit. It's a normal tactics. It's a usual tactics, this mimicry, when the logos of famous brands or media are used to spread misinformation, and those can be both regional mass media, official websites of the government, and those can be absolutely fake sites. We've noticed that in Ukrainian and Russian-speaking Telegram's environment, there are links to so-called foreign websites who act as independent source, but if you dig deeper, they turn out to be fake sites that were created to spread such misinformation. Why do they turn out to be fakes? Because they only contain just a couple of anti-Ukrainian posts, and there is information about sports or entertainment, but it's not been updated. Those pages remain blank. Meanwhile, the site may exist for a month. And unprotected site protocol, absence of information about the media itself, about the journalists, about the legal address, all of those are signs of that site being fake one. So this is what the second section describes. Also, we've decided that it's important to segregate specifically the top 10 mechanisms, top 10 tools used by Russian propaganda to disseminate their misinformation. And on this slide you can see the description of those mechanisms. Like bot, there is a description of bots. It says it's a software that imitates the real user, and there are examples of the way it looks in reality, and there is a short procedure how to act as soon as you identify a bot. Another section of the guidelines is about fact-checking itself, basically the tools that are needed to check the misinformation. And here I would like to say that we frequently get in touch with the regional media, and we suggest them to debunk the fakes that are being spread in their regions. And on the first stages, they act cautious not to publish that fake. They are cautious not to publish it in order not to spread that misinformation, and it's important to communicate that idea to them, and it's important to sort out those fact-checking tools in order not only to check information by ourselves, but also to use them to communicate with the population, because if we give the population the detailed analysis of how the debunkment is going on in our materials, we always provide the logic of such debunkment. We provide all of the foundations, so to say. The readers can get familiarized with the procedure, and then they can probably not use it, but at least recall that procedure and ask themselves questions that to the information that was published in this or that material, and they may ask themselves whether they need to share that information. So basically we provide advice about how to use fact-checking in the everyday life to check for a number of information sources and not to spread information if you have any doubts about it. And definitely here in this slide you can see the example of how this procedure is illustrated. For example, there is such a tool as previous versions of the web pages. It's quite a useful tool because it allows to find the primary source if it was deleted. And here we see it has a description. Then there is an example of its use on specific article, and it's all illustrated in a very practical manner, so it can be used as guidelines, as as a book that, as a textbook that you can open, read, and find the information that you need. Basically, I agree with the statement that not every fake, not every manipulation requires response, and sometimes it's better to ignore rather than spreading it. And specifically for such situations, we've developed the generalized procedure. The last section of the guidelines, it includes all the previous tools, and it has the unified procedure about how to respond to information threats. So we start with analyzing the information that we're seeing, and right here there is such a table. We're asking ourselves 3 questions. To what extent is the fake that we see is being spread? How it's being spread within the short period of time? How big is the source of spread? And how harmful is it? So basically, does this information influence the health of the populations, public security, international reputation of Ukraine? And we give points based on those questions. If the majority of responses is 0 points, like a small source of dissemination, we understand that this information is not going to become popular, it's not going to spread through the mass. So basically, in that case, we probably choose the strategy of ignoring. Then, if we see the signs that information may grow into something like a misinformation campaign, then we choose the strategy to counteract it. And then we describe the strategies themselves. Basically, we suggest using those advantages that local governments and local media have, communicating with the population through their own channels and talking about recommendations. We recommend the media to talk in simple words about the complicated things, and for the local authorities, use the official communication channels, get in touch with the colleagues from other regions to prevent spreading of misinformation, or if they see that it can potentially be interesting or it can influence the denizens of the neighboring region, it's relevant to respond in order to prevent it. And now I think that I've mentioned the word pre-bunking. Now it's debunking and pre-bunking, 2 basic forms of counteracting misinformation. So debunking is when we respond to the threat, and pre-bunking is about training the population in how not to succumb to those fakes and manipulations. And our key tools are used both for debunking and pre-bunking. So we use it for debunking as soon as we identify fakes and manipulations, and we use it as pre-bunking when we communicate it to the population. And sometimes fakes or manipulations may be a part of the bigger expanded narrative, and there it's relevant to have idea about how the narratives are being created, what are the key narratives of Russian propaganda. It's useful in order to put together, to have understanding of how the narratives are being spread in the regions, what are the typical narratives for those regions. It's useful for local governments and journalists because they have opportunity to analyze the situation. They can not only respond to specific facts, but also to act in a more complex manner to track the tendencies about how the misinformation is being spread in their regions. And as we were talking about the levels of threat, as we identify the level of threat as high, as we see a piece of some major misinformation campaign, it's relevant to use the direct impact measures. They're more about government authorities. For example, you can report to the lawyers or law enforcement agencies, to the platform where the information is being published. The journalist may publish an investigation. So it's more about drastic direct impact measures that are aimed at preventing dissemination of this misinformation. So we were developing those guidelines in a way that they're practical, they're convenient, so you can open them and start using them right away. For example, if you're curious about something, you can check the tool on the list and you can start using it right away. And using these guidelines, well, basically you can get familiarized with it in the website of Vox Ukraine, and we kindly invite you to view it. Thank you, Ms. Alina, Ms. Nataliia, Mr. Ivan. Let me ask you, so talking about misinformation, let me ask you, to what extent the impact of misinformation has changed in your regions? To what extent are you experiencing it? Ms. Nataliia, let's start with you. Good afternoon, everybody, or good morning, everybody. Am I being heard? The connection is sometimes not quite good, so if I'm being interrupted, please, or if I'm breaking up, please let me know so I stop. So talking about misinformation and life in the region close to the border, we live and work at the distance of 7 kilometers from Kursk region. The situation is now quite complicated, and it's complicated because of those fakes, manipulations, and sometimes even psyops, because the information comes in small pieces, and sometimes it's good that we don't know and we don't understand everything that's going on, but on the other hand, it's difficult to find out how to act, and misinformation sometimes is related to the security issues, something that's related to the life and health of the people. Our first and the biggest misinformation problem, I don't know how to properly call it, but those are the schedules of offensives starting from 24th of February 2022, and then after April 2022, when Sumy region was liberated, there is a number of fakes being thrown in. They will be offensive again and again and again, and people are always being anxious. They are being in difficult psychological condition. One, two. Miss Nataliia, we've lost the signal, it seems to me. However, it's very well. You're not hearing me? Now you're back. We can hear you. You're clear and loud. And among us, we call them the offensive schedules, and they really destabilize the situation in our region. And there are information about like 4 battalions of Kadyrov troops. Here the material is coming from the railway platforms. Many people take it in anxious manner. Some stay, some leave, and the government authorities sometimes are a source of this anxiety. They either announce days off, for example, they say the municipality is not going to work. People get frightened, like the offensive is coming, and this is the situation that persists for a third year. And sometimes when the threat is real and we had to evacuate the whole village, people were not believing it. Like they were saying, they keep intimidating us all the time. They will be offensive again and again. And when there was a real bombardment of the village, and until the very last moment, the citizens were not believing until that moment that they were forced to sit in the cellar for 3 days under the bombs and shells. And that was probably the most awful situation. When we don't know whether the threat is real or not, there are manipulations that the troops are coming. The troops are coming close to the border. The material is being unloaded from the railway. So those are the biggest threats, something that everyone keeps hearing. But there are other threats, other phenomena when the Russians think that is their work, that they start disseminating those topics, that the rich stay at home and the poor ones are at the front lines, then that there will be no pensions, there will be no social support. So those are the topics that influence the conscience and condition of our people. Ms. Nataliia, in your opinion, what is the role of, if we look at this through the prism of local media, through the prism of local government, and maybe of civil society, so what is the role of all of them in debunking of the myth, fight, and misinformation? Because on your example, we understand that it's about the life and health of people. It's really, really important. Well, first of all, is the unification of government authorities in one information space. I don't mean TV marathon, but if the regional and municipal government talk about it, it should be one information flow. If there is a talk about threat to the municipality and the region itself, then it's probably real, but all of the local communities may disseminate different types of misinformation, and the official status of sources. I'm an editor-in-chief of Belopila city website and a local newspaper. We work with our colleagues. We have very little number of printed media left and very little number of official media left. So basically the media that are responsible for information they publish. We have a lot of Telegram channels, some Facebook groups, authors of which we can only guess who is behind them. But everyone who opens their group in Telegram channel tries to throw in some information there and then to spread it and to create such a hysterical sentiment. So it's about cooperation with those media who are certified and who are responsible. But again, it doesn't work quite well because the local governments, the regional governments, sometimes they have the Telegram channels which are not always transparent. The information popping up there may be shared from other sources. So again, this bridge of communication is not well regulated, and the local media, of course, they are responsible for any sharing of information. They are legally responsible, they have official registration, and they have big authority. For example, our newspaper becomes 104 years this year, so it was generations of the families who subscribe to our newspaper. So no matter how you view the printed media, but they enjoy certain trust in certain territories that was built within centuries in our case. So again, trust to those media that are responsible. Thank you for joining us, Ms. Nataliia. Mr. Ivan, let me ask you the same question. What's going on with misinformation in your opinion, in your region? To what extent such misinformation has changed? How is it mimicking? To what extent is it transforming? And how do you feel Russians using that tool in your regions? Good morning. Thank you for having me. I would like to thank my colleague from Bilapila. I wish her hold on because it's really important. Well, in brief, I would divide it in three stages. First is COVID stage, pre-war stage, and stage 1 as a full-scale invasion, and stage 2 the autumn of 23, and until this time I can say. So if we find out the information sources that are being used in an active manner now, according to my observations in the region, there are about 30% of the information sources that are new, and 70% of information sources, I mean bots, that spread misinformation, mass media that spread misinformation are those sources that used to work before the war, and the majority of them were spreading those narratives that are both Russian and not so Russian. If you remember the COVID campaign about anti-vaccination, people who trust in conspiracy theories, and so on and so forth. So basically, back in that period, we were working in a different way. We were more about formulating the public concept, the influence on the public opinion leaders. There was a layering of restrictions. If you remember, there was a tax reform back then, and altogether it had a cumulative effect, and some groups, some communities were spreading that information during the full-scale invasion. We've seen them calm down, we've seen them shut up, and we've seen that misinformation about the war was more of a centralized nature. It was easier to work with it, it was easier to counteract it. It had no regional nature. Those were fakes about the advances of Russian army. So those were the general things, but starting from autumn 22, we started observing, this third stage, we've started observing reinforcement of Russian narratives and to work with the local communities through the prism of our neighbors, the countries of European Union. I'm talking about Hungary mostly, I'm talking about Slovakia and about Romania. You know, they have liberal legislation, there's a lot of political parties, some of them are right, radical, nationalistic, and through their mass media, through their communities, through their web pages, through their social media pages, and in case of Hungary, even through the official information sources, those Russian narratives were being spread that are consonant with the Russian propaganda. Let me put it like this, about Ukrainians being a cannon fodder, about Europe saturating Ukraine with arms, and it's not right because it gives the Ukraine the opportunity to continue the war. Well, the official media thankfully don't publish information about biolabs. That's mostly for the anonymous Telegram groups, which also write about big refrigerators who bring in the courses, and it's all layered over the mobilization track that is not always being perceived well in the society. And given the fact that Romanian and Hungarian languages are remote from the Slavic languages, and sometimes in the region there are 40,000 Ukrainians speaking Romanians and 70,000 Hungarians. In this case, we can say that those people consume more of those information that is published in their language, the language that they use at home, and it's very difficult to take control of those information sources. Previously, there was a broadcasting in the national minorities languages, and after the media were privatized, they ceased to exist. There is a studio at Suspilne, but obviously it's not so flexible and not so informative as it used to be. That's why we may say that there is some fraction of population that we cannot cover with our information sources. We cannot reach out to them. We had the same problem in the regions neighboring with European countries is the absence of transmitters of signal, specifically in mountainous region. Sometimes the Ukrainian radio stations don't reach us, and people listen to the radio stations from Europe that are not always loyal to us. That's in brief about the periodization of how this propaganda is transforming and mimicking. Talking about what my colleague from Sumy region has mentioned about the role of the local authorities and central government, I agree with her, and I would like to add that it's a big problem that we learn to live with. It is developing from privatization of mass media. The local governments don't have their media under their control, I mean either radio or printed media, so it's important to say that in the regions where such violent activities are going on, probably the military administration should be entitled to establish such information sources. And another problem emerged during decentralization. The communities got a lot of rights, and sometimes they abuse those rights. The administrations don't always have an opportunity to influence on them. Here I'm talking about the departments that are in charge of information activities usually deal with banal PR of the heads of the local governments whom they submit. It's important to understand that it's a problem and to find a solution to it. And the third problem is that the agencies in charge of the communication of information, those who work with military administration, sometimes, as my colleague has mentioned, we cannot hear that one voice when everybody works unison. So again, it's about coordination and it's about authorities. This coordination does not always exist in the regions. It's not always described in the regulations. In Ukraine, we have two centers that could exercise such coordination: the SNDC Misinformation Debunkment Center and the Center of Debunkment and Ministry of Culture and Information Policy. In my opinion, the Center for Countering Misinformation works very well on the track of debunking of fakes, neutralizing the operational threats. We had a good case when there was a phishing attack on telephones and messengers where the statements were shared as if the Ukrainian community somehow wants to oust Hungarians from the region. We responded quite quickly, and the Center for Strategic Communications that works with the narratives and could become a generator of such narratives. During such combat operations, during such extreme situation, there is a dilemma for us not to cross those red lines that exist for us as a democratic society, as a liberal system. So the local governments, they are always tempted to replace the mass media with themselves, to put together the agenda, to use it for their own PR. Or again, it's about the same that my colleague was mentioning, that sometimes the local and central governments, they create problems with their communication campaigns. So in my opinion, those coordination centers are supposed to have more authorities to be able to work in the regions. It's important to understand that regional centers, the departments or the directorates of information activities are aimed at covering the activities of the local or central government. They don't always have time to debunk the fakes or myth. It's not their key sector of activity. They deal with different things. So there should be regional units which submit directly to the centers, and they are only involved in those types of activities because it would be easier for them to work with the mass media. They would not depend on the local governments. It would be easier for them to work with the civil society. They would focus specifically on that. It requires basically budget allocations, but in view of the fact that information security and information fronts are extremely important, probably it's important to think about this form of cooperation. Now, talking about the guidelines where all this system is being described, where all of the best practices from all of the regions are being gathered. It's good that we have such guidelines now. It's necessary because sometimes even as you go to the training, you don't remember how to work with it afterwards. But as you look at the guidelines, you can see directly the procedure about how to work with this or that material, because in extreme situations, it's good to have a procedure at hand. So that's in brief. If you have any more questions, well, Roman, thank you very much for such a holistic statement, for such a comprehensive speech. It looks like it's in different parts of our country, but the problems are quite alike. We can draw conclusions. Haven't heard to you. We can draw conclusions that Russia does use those tools. They use it in quite efficient manner. With the beginning of the full-scale invasion, this type of tool is intensely adapting, changing, being modified. Russians use a lot of resources, and a lot of experts work in this area. Well, if we see that the channels are so diverse, that the tools that they use are so diverse, they are being used in your regions. They are all different, but they are all aimed at the same situation: disruption, destabilization, undermining of Ukrainian statehood. Thank you very much. I hope that these guidelines will really come in handy, that you, Alina, will be able to disseminate it where it's necessary. So it's yet another question. So what is your plan? How do you plan to disseminate these guidelines? We see that the problems really exist. Specifically, there is a problem with the unity of our local and central governments. Probably they will need this type of material over there, because we see, our colleagues confirm it, that one thing is when Russia has such misinformation attacks aimed at us, but sometimes the local governments become those who create such situations. So what is your plan for dissemination again? Well, thank you for your question. Actually, the second stage of the presentation of these guidelines is the series of trainings in the regions where we are about to tell about how to use the guidelines. So basically, we are going to make the regions familiarized with these procedures. They will try to hear it during the trainings, and then to support it with the fact that they have the guidelines at hand, they will be able to use it further on, getting back to the procedures with the use of those guidelines. Thank you very much for this wonderful work, something that is really useful, something that is really needed for our journalists, for the local governments. Thank you very much. I hope it will be really disseminated quite well, and I would like to thank our security and defense forces, thanks to whom we can continue holding events like this. So let's continue working together for our victory. Glory to Ukraine, glory to the heroes.
Дякую за запрошення. Дискусія має бути, адже саме в дискусії народжуються відповіді на багато питань, які сьогодні стоять перед нами. І питання, і навіть виклики. Дякую.
Дякую.
Дякую.